Hey everyone, FusedVR coming at you, and hope this video finds you doing super well. And honestly, recording this video kind of feels a little weird, just kind of given the type of video and kind of given the state of the economy with the Wuhan virus. I might make a separate video on kind of the impact of that on VR later, probably after this whole thing dies off and we can kind of digest it more calmly. But really the main reason I'm making this video right now is actually I'm going to be starting a new job, and so I figured it might be worth it to at least document for myself the factors I looked at while searching for companies in AR VR, as well as just kind of what companies I looked at and how I grouped them and kind of how I felt, just kind of in general, how I would feel working at those companies. And at least if it helps one of you guys, that's even more better. And as always, if you do find this video insightful, make sure to leave a like on the video. It really does help out the channel a ton. And with all of that said, I can pretty much just quickly start talking about things. I don't want this video to be incredibly long by any stretch of the imagination. So, I mean, as far as criterias go, there were really three core things I looked for. Obviously, you can kind of add criteria or remove criteria depending on your specific needs and what you're kind of looking for. But really for me, the three core things have been stability, the team that I'm working with, and then the actual work I'll be doing, and really in that order. So when I think stability, it's kind of an interesting one, and it really is relevant at times like this. And it's more for the sake of, I feel like this is more in general for the sake of AR VR jobs. But when I say stability, I don't really mean this as like it's the most stable company in the world, it's going to be here indefinitely, but rather, is this a company that's going to be successful or around within 2 years, which is kind of traditionally, on average, how long, especially kind of the younger generations, tend to stay at companies. You could extend this to 3-4 years, however really long you envision staying there. But we can go with the average of, say, 2 years, for example. And will it be a company that's invested in VR in 2 years? I mean, we are in an industry that changes quite rapidly, and that question kind of changes, honestly, on a day-to-day basis. But it's not really surprising that a lot of companies, while on the surface might be super excited about AR VR, when you really go down and grill them about it, oftentimes there isn't even a game plan or a roadmap that goes out as far as 2 years. And for me, that's really concerning, especially if your goal is to have a stable career for at least a minimum of 2 years. You want to be confident that while you're working there, you get to do the stuff that you're doing. You're not going to have to worry about a job if there's some crazy virus that's running rampant, and it's rewarding. So that's kind of why I value stability so highly, and it's really something that helps prune down a lot of companies, believe it or not. And the other two criteria that I have are fairly self-explanatory. So obviously you want to make sure you're working well with the team and they're a good fit for you, you're a good fit for them. And I mean, 2 years, while kind of in the grand scheme of things isn't a huge amount of time, it's significant that I feel like it's worth, at least at a high level, getting to know your team and making sure that there are people you're compatible working with. And then as far as projects go, exact same thing. I mean, things might change a little bit here and there, especially if you're at a startup, for example, where kind of problems tend to come out of nowhere, if you will. You want to be fairly happy with what the project is, or be flexible with what the day in, day out changes might be. But in general, kind of, at least given the AR VR space, like that's really how I kind of rank my criteria, and this really kind of helps me vet any company that I'm talking to, and kind of also kind of hones your questions. Like, I really want to make sure this is stable, and then kind of hone in on those other criteria as kind of secondary features. And they honestly start as really good conversation points, especially in any interview. So that pretty much does it as far as criteria go. And from there, we can kind of start applying those criteria to different types of companies. And in general, what I typically did was kind of grouped companies into kind of three main categories. Quite frankly, you could just group these into as many categories as you want, but I think for the purposes of this video, 3 will honestly cover a lot of ground for us. And I'm going to refrain here from passing any judgment on specific types of companies, but rather kind of address them as a group. So first group we're going to be talking about is companies that have a lot of money to invest in AR/VR, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. So the main 3 that I would think about here are Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. And again, these are just kind of the main ones that I think are really kind of crucial in this space and are just pumping in piles and piles of cash. You could also add here HTC or Valve, quite frankly, even Niantic would probably fit here as well. And in general, these are companies that tend to be pretty stable-wise. Again, they're clearly invested in VR and AR for the long haul, and you can easily see if you get a job today, then you would probably have a job in the same space doing the same thing within 2 years time frame. Team and project-wise, honestly, this is going to kind of vary on a case-by-case basis, and the reason being is there are a bunch of different teams at all of these companies that work from everything from the hardware to the marketing to the software side of things, you name it. And in that sense, you really just have to vet things on what this team is specifically doing on this given project. But in general, because these are big companies, the interview process will probably work a little differently than the other 2 types of groups that I'm going to be talking about. And as a result, especially if you're going in from the software side of things, you may or may not actually end up being able to directly interact with the team that you're trying to apply for. And in that sense, it can kind of get a little tricky, and that's a little unfortunate and kind of one of the downsides in my end. If you have any opportunities, I highly recommend make sure that you have a chance to talk with whoever the manager for that team is, any team leads, etc., to just kind of get a sense for that specific team and how it operates. Because quite frankly, that's probably the biggest variable when it comes to any of these big companies that are in this space. Second group is going to be companies that are thinking of VR and AR as more of, say, R&D projects or product innovation, or potentially even second lines of revenue. So personally, I find that this is the place where I see the most amount of hiring. And honestly, I think these are the companies that have, at least for me personally, the most amount of interesting potential. And just to name a couple companies here, quite frankly, this is probably the biggest group and it has the most variety. But this could be companies like Unity or Unreal. Obviously, they're game engines, but at the same time, they have to develop for the tools for AR and VR. You could quite frankly put Google here just because they've kind of toned down their hiring as of recently for AR and VR. So I think they're kind of more in this middle group, if you will. And you also have a lot of opportunities that might be off the beaten path. So I think Udacity, where I used to work, is a pretty good example where we were building out an AR VR course as part of their giant educational platform. And there's everything in between. Again, this is probably a big group and would need to be broken down, but I do think stability-wise in general for this type of group, these do tend to be companies that are fairly stable in their main line of business, and as a result are kind of willing to explore with, say, virtual reality or augmented reality for whatever the reason might be. While it's not probably to the scale of, say, the group 1, you do have some kind of backbone from the main source of revenue to kind of help whatever your team and project are within that company, which I think is kind of this unique concept. In general, your teams and projects tend to be a little bit smaller in scale, but I think that also comes with the benefit of having a lot of ownership over those specific projects and the opportunity, I think, to share AR and VR to kind of a broader audience, especially at companies where it absolutely has nothing to do with their main product, and it's an opportunity to show how AR and VR can really add value to that specific company, which in turn hopefully generates some revenue and in turn hopefully kind of can grow whatever the AR VR side of things is within that company to be at a much bigger scale. And that's why I think it's kind of probably the most interesting potential in that I see, because you'll have decent sized budgets. There is, I think in my opinion, there's slightly higher risk here. It's not going to be nearly as stable as, say, the first group, just because, quite frankly, if you hit a recession with this silly pesky virus going around, AR, VR projects or just R&D projects in general might be the first things that get cut. But at the same time, assuming there's a little bit of stability, I think there's a lot of potential here to really make an impact. And that's kind of why I tend to apply to the second group the most, and also why I think you also see a lot of different companies that kind of fit this second group, if you will. And the third group here is actually probably it kind of piggybacks off the second group, in the sense that the second group, if you were to summarize it, you'll see the phrase startup within a big company tagged around a lot. And so while the startup in a big company kind of refers more to the second group, startups and studios would probably be the third group. To be honest, this is probably the group I apply the least to, and that's kind of twofold. One, because quite frankly, there aren't that many that are at the stage that they can actively hire a lot. And two, I tend to personally look for companies where AR and VR is not just the focus of that company. Whereas when I think of this third group, I think it's primarily solely working on an AR VR project. Obviously, to name a few here, there are going to be quite a few that you've heard, but you have your unicorns like Beat Saber that were eventually able to be acquired by Oculus, as well as, say, more well-funded companies like, say, Magic Leap, Stress Level Zero, Striver, or even the Void VR, I think are pretty good examples here of kind of bigger sized startups, but of course you also have everything in between all the way down to your one or two-man studios, if you will. Stability-wise, quite frankly for me, again, also, startups and studios in general tend to be the least stable, especially if they're just only focused on AR and VR. And so in that sense, I personally find it a little risky. Again, it kind of depends on the stage of that startup and kind of where it's at in the pipeline. But that's something you definitely really need to consider and make sure you vet when you are talking to any specific startup or studio. But at the same time, I think the teams and projects that startups and studios work on tend to have the most creative flexibility. You will get some stocks or shares in that company, so you'll have some ownership over things and will kind of be incentivized to make sure things succeed. And I personally think that these types of teams and projects have the most kind of passion behind it. And I think this is generally true, not always true, but generally true for the startup and studio side of things that you might not necessarily see in the first two groups. And in that sense, I kind of find that super refreshing. It's kind of the type of energy that VR and AR really need to continue on the growth trajectory that everyone wants it to be on. And it's where you get a lot of crazy cool ideas that kind of come out of nowhere. So in that regard, if you can kind of find something that you feel has the right amount of stability for you, and you are kind of willing to go, not necessarily go all in, but kind of close to that, if you will, to try and make whatever you're working on succeed, startups and studios could be a potentially really cool option. And it's something that I definitely kind of want more and more of those types of companies to succeed in. But that pretty much wraps up a high-level summary across all those three groups, and hopefully you find that useful. Actually, speaking of startups, that kind of is a quick segue into where I'm going to be working at, which is a company called Mobile Edge X. It's a startup focused on edge computing. So not AR, VR specifically, but edge computing, kind of very quickly summarized, is a means to bring the cloud closer to applications so that you minimize latency. So kind of akin to 5G, if you will. And as a result, you kind of start to see a lot of use cases around AR and VR and gaming, especially when it comes to multiplayer or anything to do with networking. So even to the point where you can try to do remote rendering, if you will. So in that sense, I kind of find this kind of blending of a bunch of technologies really, really exciting, which is why I'm super stoked to be actually working with them as a developer advocate. And I get to start prototyping with a bunch of different applications that kind of bleed across all these different lines, if you will. So in that sense, really excited to see what the future holds and excited to be joining that team. Actually, when this video goes live, I might have already joined that team. But yeah, that's where I'm going to be at. And I should also say that that's by no means going to impact what's going to be happening here on the channel. I'm still planning to do tutorials, have the directional dissolve shader coming up really soon, so you can look forward to that, hopefully within the next 1 or 2 weeks once this video goes live. That's just a quick update on my side, and hopefully this video was super useful to you guys and not kind of me just rambling around. But I think that pretty much wraps it up here. Again, make sure to leave a like on the video if you did find this insightful and not just me rambling around. And also, if you guys are looking for jobs, definitely let me know in the comments below, and maybe someone else in the comments will see that and kind of can start hiring that way. We'll have to wait and see. But I think that would be super awesome if we can do some matchmaking down in the comments. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. It's been Fuse Man, and I'm signing out.